The air hung heavy in Montgomery's dusty courtroom, 90 degrees outside, as Judge Harold Vance, a pinched-faced white man, glared down at Lena Carter. She stood tall, a black woman unshaken, fined $1,000 for a parking spat. He called disorderly. His smirk faded when she said, "I'm a federal prosecutor." The gavel froze. Whispers erupted. A bailiff muttered about a past case unraveling, hinting at chaos to come. What had Vance buried that could ruin him, and how would it shatter Lena's future? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice, hit like and subscribe, because tomorrow's explosive episode is one you can't miss. 3 weeks before the courtroom showdown, the night clung to Montgomery's outskirts like a damp shroud, humidity thick enough to choke on, the thermometer stuck at 85 degrees even after sunset. Crickets buzzed in the overgrown fields, their chorus a restless hum beneath the faint growl of Lena Carter's engine as she guided her silver sedan homeward. She was bone-tired, eyes stinging from 12 hours hunched over case files in the federal courthouse downtown, her mind still tangled in the threads of a high-stakes prosecution she'd been building for months. The defendant was a slick predatory lender, a vulture in a tailored suit who'd bled black retirees dry, siphoning their savings into his offshore accounts with promises of easy loans that turned into financial shackles. Lena had spent the last 4 weeks dissecting bank records, cross-checking forged signatures, and prepping witnesses, some too frail to stand but fierce enough to testify. Winning this wasn't just a notch on her career belt. It was a brick in the wall of justice she'd been stacking her whole life, a wall she knew could crumble for people who looked like her if folks like that lender kept clawing at it. The city, lights flickered past her windows, streaks of gold against the black, her favorite jazz playlist murmuring through the speakers, too soft to pull her from the closing arguments she was mentally rehearsing. She barely noticed the road unfurling ahead, a familiar ribbon of asphalt she'd driven 1,000 times, until a sudden pulse of red and blue flared in her rearview mirror. Her stomach sank, a cold knot tightening fast, the kind every black person in America knew too well, no matter how many degrees hung on their wall or how clean their record stayed. Lena's hand snapped to 10 and 2 on the wheel, fingers curling tight around the leather, her breath shallow as she glanced at the speedometer. 50 miles per hour, dead on the limit. No swerving, no red lights missed, nothing to justify those lights slicing through the dark behind her. Still, she flicked on her blinker, easing the car onto the gravel shoulder, tires crunching as she rolled to a stop. Her pulse thudded in her ears, a steady drumbeat urging her to stay calm, stay polite, stay alive. She'd seen too many cases, read too many reports to pretend this was just a routine check. The officer stepped out of his cruiser, silhouette sharp against the flashing lights, a broad-shouldered white man in his late 30s, buzz-cut tight enough to gleam under the street lamp. His boots crunched closer, deliberate, each step kicking up dust that swirled in the humid air. Lena lowered her window, the night's sticky heat flooding in, and kept her hands visible, resting on the wheel like a surrender. The flashlight hit her eyes first, a blinding beam that made her squint, but she didn't flinch. His name tag glinted, Officer Dwayne Pratt. "License and registration," he barked, voice flat and hard, his right hand hovering near the holster strapped to his hip. Lena nodded, slow and careful, reaching for her purse on the passenger seat, fingers brushing the leather as she pulled out her wallet. "Officer, can I ask what I did wrong?" she said, keeping her tone even, professional, the way she'd trained herself since she was old enough to drive. Pratt's jaw tightened, the flashlight dipping just enough to catch the glint in his pale eyes. "How you swerved suspiciously," he said, words clipped, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. Lena blinked, her brow furrowing despite her effort to stay neutral. Swerved. She'd been straight as an arrow, every move deliberate. Her turn signals a habit drilled into her since her father sat her down at 16 and told her she'd never get the benefit of the doubt. "Are you sure?" "I'm pretty careful about that," she said, voice steady but laced with a question she already knew he wouldn't answer. His eyes darkened, narrowing into slits, and he leaned closer, the flashlight swinging back up to pin, her face in its glare. "You questioning me?" he snapped, the words dripping with venom. his hand shifting to rest fully on the holster now, fingers twitching like they itched to move. Lena exhaled, sharp and controlled, biting back the flood of arguments that rose in her throat. She knew the game, had seen it played out in depositions and dashcam footage, knew how fast it could turn deadly if she pushed too hard. "No, sir, just surprised, that's all," she said, handing over her license and registration, her fingers steady despite the heat creeping up her spine. Pratt snatched the papers, barely glancing at them, his gaze locked on her like he was sizing up prey. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, stepping back and gesturing with the flashlight, the beam cutting a harsh arc through the night. Lena's breath caught, a jolt of ice running through her veins. "Excuse me," she said, voice still calm but edged with steel now, her mind racing through every legal right she had, every protocol he was bending. "I said step out," he repeated, louder, his hand clamping onto the holster, thumb brushing the snap like a threat. Lena's jaw clenched, teeth grinding as she weighed her options. Argue and it could escalate. Comply and it was humiliation she'd have to swallow. She chose the latter, not because she wanted to, but because she wasn't about to let this night end with her name on a coroner's report. She pushed the door open, stepping onto the pavement, the gravel biting into her flats, the cold night air prickling her skin through her blazer. Truckers rumbled past, headlights washing over her, some slowing to gawk, their horns blaring in. The distance like a taunting chorus. "Hands on the hood," Pratt ordered, circling her like a wolf, his flashlight swinging to her car's interior now, probing the shadows. Lena placed her palms on the warm metal, the engine's heat seeping through her fingers, her heart pounding so loud she swore he could hear it. Pratt frisked her, his hands rough and deliberate, patting down her legs, her arms, her back, lingering just long enough to make her skin crawl. She stood rigid, staring at the hood's chipped paint, forcing her breath to stay even as humiliation burned hotter than the Alabama sun. Headlights from passing cars lit her up, a spectacle on the roadside, some drivers staring with pity, others with blank indifference, as if this was just another Tuesday night. Maybe it was. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, voice low but firm, the anger coiling tight in her chest, ready to snap. "Necessary?" Pratt chuckled, a dry, grating sound, stepping around to rummage through her purse without a word of consent, his fingers digging past her keys and phone. "Yeah, it is. People like you always have something to hide." Lena's jaw locked, her nails digging into her palms against the hood. "People like you." The words landed like a slap, raw and unfiltered, stripping away her title, her years of law school, her late nights fighting for justice, reducing her to a stereotype he'd already convicted. She swallowed the retort, the fury. Knowing it wouldn't change his mind, wouldn't stop his hands from pulling out her Department of Justice badge from the purse's side pocket. He froze, just for a second, the badge gleaming under his flashlight, the embossed seal catching the light. His eyes narrowed, flicking from the ID to her face, a slow, mocking smile spreading across his lips. "You work for the feds," he said, voice dripping with disdain, holding the badge up like it was a joke. "Yes," Lena replied, meeting, his gaze refusing to let him see the tremor in her chest, the rage clawing to break free. "I'm a federal prosecutor." His lip curled, a sneer twisting his features, and he tossed the badge onto the passenger seat like it was trash. "Figures," he muttered, scribbling on his ticket pad with exaggerated slowness, each scratch of the pen a deliberate jab. He tore off the citation, thrusting it toward her, the paper crinkling in the humid air. "There you go, counselor. Failure to signal, see you in court." Lena took it, fingers trembling, not with fear, but with a fury so deep it felt like fire in her bones. She'd spent her career believing in the system, fighting its flaws from the inside, but standing there, ticket in hand, under the harsh glow of Pratt's cruiser lights, she saw it clear as day. This wasn't about a swerve or a signal. It was about power, about putting her in her place, about reminding her that no badge, no title could shield her from the weight of his prejudice. As Pratt strutted back to his car, boots kicking up dust, Lena climbed into her sedan, the ticket, crumpled in her fist, the spark of a war she hadn't asked for already smoldering. Sweat beaded on Lena Carter's neck, trickling down her spine as she stood in the Montgomery courtroom. The air thick with late summer heat, despite the rattling window unit struggling at 90 degrees. 3 weeks had crawled by since Officer Pratt's roadside power play, and now she faced the ticket in Judge Harold Vance's domain, a cramped chamber of peeling paint and warped wood. The judge perched high on his polished oak bench like a vulture eyeing carrion. Vance was a wiry white man in his 60s, face pinched tight as if he'd sucked a lemon dry, his grey eyes glinting with a cold authority that had crushed countless lives under his gavel. Around town, folks whispered his name with dread, especially in the black neighborhoods where his tough-on-crime stance meant jail for jaywalking if your skin wasn't pale enough. Lena had come prepared, her navy blazer crisp, her notes tucked under her arm, expecting a quick dismissal of Pratt's bogus failure to signal charge. She'd seen flimsier cases tossed out in 10 minutes flat. What could go wrong in a room built for justice? The bailiff called her forward, voice booming over the hum of ceiling fans, and Lena stepped to the defendant's table, heels clicking on the scuffed floor. A dozen spectators lounged in the pews, some fanning themselves with folded papers, others staring with idle curiosity, the kind that turns sour when boredom sets in. Vance barely glanced at her, his fingers drumming the bench as he shuffled through a stack of files, lips pursed like he'd already made up his mind. "Lena Carter," he drawled, voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You're here contesting a citation for failure to signal. Plead your case and make it quick. I don't have all day for petty squabbles." Lena straightened, her chin lifting, every syllable measured as she began. "Your Honor, I'm requesting dismissal. The officer's claim is baseless. I signaled every turn, as I always do, and there's no dashcam footage to support his accusation. This is a misunderstanding at best, harassment at worst." Vance's eyes flicked up then, locking onto hers, and the room seemed to shrink under the weight of his stare. A smirk tugged at his thin lips, faint but venomous, and he leaned forward, elbows digging into the bench. "Misunderstanding?" he echoed, voice dripping with mockery. "Sounds like excuses to me. You think you're special, don't you? Too uppity to follow the rules like everyone else." Lena's jaw tightened, her pulse spiking as the word landed, a jab laced with decades of hate she'd heard too many times before. Uppity. It wasn't just an insult. It was a chain, meant to drag her down to a place he thought she belonged. She swallowed the fire rising in her throat, keeping her tone steady. "No, Your Honor, I follow the law. That's why I'm here asking for evidence that doesn't exist." The spectators shifted, a murmur rippling through them, but Vance's smirk only widened, his fingers curling around the gavel like a weapon. "Evidence?" he snorted, leaning back now, his chair creaking under his slight frame. "I've got an officer's word against yours, and I know who I trust. You think you can waltz in here and talk your way out of consequences? Not in my courtroom." Lena's hands clenched at her sides, nails biting into her palms as she fought to keep her composure. This wasn't about the ticket anymore. It was about power, about a white judge flexing his muscle over a black woman who dared to stand tall. She took a breath, voice firm. "Your Honor, with respect, I haven't been allowed to fully present my defense. If you'd let me finish." "But—" Vance cut her off, his gavel slamming down with a crack that echoed off the walls, silencing the room like a gunshot. "Enough. I've heard all I need. Fines $1,000, payable now or appeal if you've got the stomach for it. Next case." The crowd gasped, a sharp intake of air that buzzed with disbelief. $1,000 for a traffic ticket? It was absurd, punitive, a slap meant to sting long after the echo faded. Lena's chest burned, her mind reeling as she stared up at Vance, his smug satisfaction radiating like heat off asphalt. She could pay it, sure, her salary could cover it without blinking, but that wasn't the point. This was personal, a public shaming dressed up as justice, and every eye in the room knew it. She stepped closer to the bench, her voice rising, clear and unshaken. "Your Honor, I'm a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice. I know the law, and this ruling ignores due process." The words hung in the air, heavy and electric, and for a split second Vance froze, his gavel hovering mid-air, his grey eyes widening as if she'd struck him. The courtroom erupted in whispers, heads swiveling. The spectators leaning forward now, their curiosity morphing into something sharper, hungrier. A federal prosecutor, here, in Vance's little kingdom. His composure cracked, just for a moment, the smirk slipping as he blinked, processing the weight of her title. But then his face hardened, the mask snapping back into place, and he leaned forward again, voice quieter but laced with venom. Prosecutor or not, doesn't change the facts. You broke the law, and I don't care what fancy badge you carry. Fine stands. Appeal if you want to waste your time. Lena's hands trembled not with fear but with a rage so fierce it felt like it could split her open. She'd faced prejudice before, from cops, from colleagues, but this was different. A judge, a gatekeeper of justice, wielding his power like a whip against her skin, her race, her very existence. She nodded once, sharp and deliberate, her eyes locked on his. I'll appeal, she said, voice cutting through the murmurs, a promise more than a statement. This isn't over. Vance's smirk twitched, but he waved her off, already turning to the next file, dismissing her like she was nothing. Lena gathered her notes, her movements precise, every step toward the exit, a battle to keep her dignity intact. The crowd parted, some staring with pity, others with a flicker of respect, but she barely noticed. Her mind was already spinning, plotting, the finer spark igniting a fire she'd carry far beyond this room. As she reached the door, a janitor, an older black man with deep lines etched into his face, slipped a folded note into her hand, his touch quick and discreet. She unfolded it outside, the words scrawled in shaky ink. Vance's secrets run deep. Watch your back. Lena's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the paper as she stood in the hallway, the courtroom's hum fading behind her. Secrets. What had Vance buried that could rattle a man so untouchable? She tucked the note into her pocket, her resolve hardening like steel. This wasn't just about a ticket or a fine anymore. It was a war, one she hadn't started but wouldn't lose. The janitor's warning echoed in her head, a shadow stretching long into her future, promising battles she couldn't yet see. What kind of corruption hid behind that gavel, and who was pulling the strings to keep it buried? Leave a comment number 1 if you think Vance's ruling was a blatant abuse of power. Hit like if you're rooting for Lena to fight back, and subscribe because you won't believe the storm brewing in her next move. What's Vance hiding? That's got someone slipping notes in the dark, and how far will he go to keep it quiet? 2 days after the courtroom clash, Lena Carter strode into the federal courthouse in downtown Montgomery, her heels echoing off the polished marble floors, the air cool at 70 degrees, thanks to the humming AC that drowned out the 90-degree swelter outside. Her navy blazer hung sharp on her shoulders, her briefcase clutched tight, the janitor's cryptic note still burning a hole in her pocket. She'd spent the weekend drafting a judicial misconduct complaint against Judge Harold Vance. Every word. A blade aimed at his smug facade, detailing his bias. His refusal to hear her defense, the $1,000 fine that reeked of spite. She'd filed it with the state judicial board that morning, a quiet triumph pulsing in her chest as she imagined Vance squirming under scrutiny. For once she felt the system might bend her way, that her title, her fight, could crack his armor. She'd even called her DOJ supervisor, a gruff but fair woman named Carla Hines, who'd promised to flag the case upstairs. Lena allowed herself a flicker of hope, a rare thing in a world that so often snuffed it out. Her office sat on the 5th floor, a sleek corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's sprawl, the Alabama River glinting in, the distance under a late afternoon sun. She'd earned this view through years of late nights, of clawing past whispers that she didn't belong, that a black woman couldn't cut it in the federal ranks. Today it felt like a reward, a perch from which she'd launch her counterattack. She swiped her keycard, the lock clicking open, and stepped inside, expecting the familiar scent of coffee and paper, the hum of her desktop waiting to churn through. More evidence against that predatory lender she was prosecuting. Instead, a wave of chaos hit her like a fist. Her office was a war zone. Files shredded into confetti across the carpet, her desk flipped onto its side, drawers yanked out and spilling pens and notepads like guts. Glass from a shattered lamp crunched under her flats as she froze, her breath catching in her throat, the air suddenly heavy with the sour tang of spray paint. Lena's eyes darted to the wall behind her desk, where bold red letters screamed across the plaster, each stroke dripping like blood. "Go back to the ghetto." The words punched through her, raw and jagged, stripping away the years she'd spent building this life, reducing her to a slur meant to erase her. Her briefcase slipped from her hand, thudding to the floor, her knees trembling as she took in the wreckage. Bookshelves toppled, case binders torn apart, her framed law degree smashed on the ground, the glass spider-webbed over her name. She stumbled forward, hands shaking as she touched the edge of her overturned chair. The leather slashed open with a knife's precision. This wasn't random. It was personal, a message carved into her sanctuary, a retaliation so swift it stole her breath. Her complaint against Vance had barely hit the board's inbox, and already the backlash was clawing at her door. She forced herself to move, to think, pulling her phone from her pocket with fingers that felt numb. She dialed building security, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "This is Lena Carter, 5th floor. My office has been vandalized. I need someone up here now." The guard on the line stammered, promising a team in 5 minutes, but Lena wasn't waiting. She scanned the room, searching for clues, her prosecutor's instincts kicking in even as her heart pounded against her ribs. The windows were intact. No forced entry there, and the door's lock hadn't been jimmied. Whoever did this had access, a keycard, maybe even clearance. Her mind flashed to Pratt, his sneer on that roadside, his cruiser's lights still haunting her rearview mirror. Could he have pulled this off, or was Vance's reach longer than she'd feared? Footsteps echoed in the hall and Lena tensed, stepping back from the wreckage, as 2 security guards burst in, both white men in their 40s, their faces paling as they took in the scene. "Jesus," one muttered, a lanky guy with a patchy beard, his badge reading Tompkins. "What happened here?" Lena pointed to the wall, her voice cold. "That's what happened. I need the footage from the hall cameras, every angle now." Tompkins nodded, radioing for the tech crew while the other guard, a stocky man with a buzz cut, started snapping photos with his phone. Lena watched them work, her mind racing, the janitor's note replaying in her head. Vance's secrets. Run deep. Was this one of them, a warning shot from a man who didn't flinch at bending justice to his will? The tech arrived 10 minutes later, a wiry kid with glasses who smelled like cheap cologne, lugging a laptop that he set up on the one unbroken table. Lena loomed over his shoulder as he pulled up the security feeds, her pulse quickening with every click. The hallway outside her office flickered onto the screen, time-stamped from noon to 4 that afternoon. She'd been in meetings downstairs all day, her office empty, vulnerable. The footage rolled, showing cleaners, clerks, a delivery guy with a stack of packages, nothing out of place until 3:37, then static. The screen blurred into grey fuzz, every camera on the 5th floor cutting out for exactly 20 minutes before snapping back to normal, no trace of an intruder, no shadow slipping through the frame. "What the hell?" Lena snapped, her voice sharp enough to make the tech flinch. "It's blank. How does that happen?" "Could be a glitch," he mumbled, adjusting his glasses, but his tone wavered, unconvincing. Lena's eyes narrowed, her fists clenching at her sides. A glitch right when her office turned into a hate crime scene. She didn't buy it. Someone had tampered with the system, someone with pull, with access. Tompkins shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze, while the buzz-cut guard muttered about filing a report. Lena barely heard them, her mind locking onto a snatch of conversation she'd overheard in the break room that morning. Say paralegal, a twitchy guy named Greg, had been laughing with a co-worker, his voice low but clear. Pratt was bragging at the bar last night, said he taught that Fed chick a lesson she won't forget. Lena hadn't thought much of it then. Just office gossip. But now it clicked into place, a puzzle piece too ugly to ignore. She stepped away from the tech, her flats crunching glass as she moved to the window, staring out at the river winding through the city below. Pratt. His hands on her that night, his sneer when he'd tossed her badge aside, his casual cruelty now spilling into her world like poison. Had he done this himself, or was he just the muscle for Vance's vendetta? Either way, her complaint hadn't just rattled the judge. It had unleashed a beast, one that struck faster and harder than she'd expected. She turned back to the guards, her voice steel. "I want copies of whatever footage you've got, even the blank spots, and I'm calling the police, federal." "Jurisdiction. This isn't some prank." Tompkins nodded, but his eyes flickered with something like fear, like he knew more than he'd say. Lena pulled out her phone again, dialing Carla Hines as the guards shuffled out, the tech packing up his gear. "Carla, it's me," she said when her boss picked up, her tone clipped. "My office got hit. Vandalized, racial slurs on the wall, files gone, security's useless, footage is blank." Carla swore under her breath, her voice gravelly with concern. "You okay?" Lena glanced at the red paint, the jagged letters glaring back at her. "I'm fine, but this is retaliation. I filed on Vance this morning and now this." Carla paused, then said, "I'll get internal affairs on it, and I'll loop in the brass. Sit tight, Lena. This just got bigger than a ticket." As she hung up, Lena's gaze settled on the wreckage, her triumph from that morning souring into something darker, heavier. She thought she'd struck a blow, that her complaint would tip the scales, but instead, it had painted a target on her back, one scrawled in red paint and broken glass. Pratt's words from the roadside echoed in her skull. "People like you always have something to hide." This wasn't just about silencing her. It was about erasing her, pushing her out of a world she'd fought to claim. She bent down, picking up a shredded page from her lender case, the ink smudged beyond recognition, and her resolve hardened. They'd hit her hard, but she wasn't broken. Not yet. The janitor's note crinkled in her pocket, a lifeline to secrets she'd unearth, no matter the cost. Rain streaked down in silver threads over Lena Carter's quiet suburban street in Montgomery. The evening sky bruised purple, the air thick with the scent of wet asphalt and pine as the temperature dipped to 65 degrees. It was 5 days since her office had been gutted, the red paint still seared into her memory. Go back to the ghetto, a taunt she couldn't scrub away. She'd spent the weekend holed up in her modest 2-story home, a brick house with a sagging porch she'd bought after her first big case, its walls lined with books and photos of her parents beaming at her law school graduation. The vandalism had rattled her, sure, but she'd rallied, leaning on Carla Hines's promise of internal affairs support and her own stubborn grit. She'd alerted her DOJ superiors about the break-in, sent them photos of the wreckage, the slur, the blank security footage, and they'd assured her they'd escalate it to the feds. For the first time since Vance's gavel fell, Lena felt a sliver of safety, like the system might finally shield her instead of swinging at her. She sat on her couch now, a glass of iced tea sweating on the coffee table, her laptop open to case notes she was rebuilding from backups, determined to keep fighting. The rain drummed a steady rhythm on the roof, lulling her into a rare moment of calm, the streetlights casting watery glows through her curtains. She'd just typed a line about the predatory lender's forged signatures when a sharp bang rattled her front door, loud enough to jolt her upright, tea sloshing onto the hardwood. Her pulse spiked, a cold prickle racing down her spine as she set the laptop aside, rising slow and cautious. Another bang, harder, insistent, followed by a voice barking through the storm. "Lena Carter, open up, Montgomery PD." Her stomach twisted, the knot from that roadside stop 3 weeks ago tightening again, Pratt's sneer flashing in her mind. She moved to the window, peeling back the curtain just enough to peek out, rain blurring the shapes on her porch. 3 figures stood there, drenched in navy jackets, flashlights cutting through the downpour. One stepped forward, pounding the door again, and the streetlight caught his face. Officer Dwayne Pratt, his buzz cut glistening wet, his eyes glinting with the same malice she'd seen under his cruiser's lights. Lena's breath hitched, her hand dropping to her phone on the couch, fingers trembling as she unlocked it and hit record. The red dot blinking to life. She wasn't facing this blind. She'd learned that much from the roadside. "What do you want?" she called, voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins, loud enough to carry over the rain's roar. Pratt's voice boomed back, thick with authority. "We've got a warrant for your arrest. Assaulting an officer. Open the door now or we're coming in." Assaulting an officer? The words slammed into her, a lie so bold it nearly knocked her off balance. She hadn't touched Pratt that night, hadn't raised a hand, had kept her palms flat on the hood while he frisked her, his hands rough and unyielding. This was a fabrication, a brick thrown to shatter her world, and she knew exactly who'd swung it. She cracked the door, chain still latched, rain spitting onto the welcome mat as she faced Pratt through the gap. He loomed there, 6 feet of soaked muscle, flanked by 2 other cops, younger guys with tight jaws and restless hands, their badges glinting under the porch light. "Show me the warrant," Lena said, her tone ice-cold, phone angled to catch. Every word, every flicker of his expression. Pratt smirked, pulling a soggy paper from his jacket, holding it up just long enough for her to see the Montgomery County seal before shoving it back in his pocket. "Signed and sealed. Says you attacked me during that traffic stop. Step out, hands where I can see 'em." Lena's chest burned, her mind racing through the night 3 weeks back. The gravel under her shoes, the trucker's horns, Pratt's "people like you" slicing through her. Assault. It was a fantasy, a twisted rewrite to bury her complaint. Against Vance, to turn her from victim to villain. "I didn't touch you," she said, voice rising, sharp and unyielding. "This is retaliation, and I'm recording every second of it. I want a supervisor here now." Pratt's smirk faltered, his eyes flicking to the phone, then narrowing into slits. "You think that little toy's gonna save you," he snapped, stepping closer, his hand dropping to his holster, fingers brushing the grip. "Open the door, or we break it down. Your choice, princess." The nickname stung, a jab meant to belittle, to strip her title away, but Lena didn't flinch. She glanced past him, spotting a neighbor across the street, an older white woman named Mrs. Ellis peering out her window, phone pressed to her ear. Another figure emerged, a teenage boy in a hoodie, filming from his porch, the red light of his camera a beacon in the rain. The street was waking up, eyes turning her way, and Lena seized it. "I'm not opening anything until a supervisor's here," she said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, her phone steady in her grip. "You've got no grounds, and I've got witnesses. Back off." Pratt's face darkened, rain streaming down his cheeks, his hand twitching toward his gun, but the other cops shifted, uneasy now, their boots scuffing the wet porch. The boy's camera swung toward them, Mrs. Ellis stepping onto her lawn, umbrella raised like a shield. Pratt glared at Lena, his breath puffing in the cool air, then muttered something low to his partners. "This ain't over, princess," he growled, stepping back, his voice a promise dripping with venom. "You'll wish you'd played nice." He turned, stalking back to the cruiser, the others trailing him, their lights flashing red and blue as they peeled away, tires splashing through puddles. Lena slammed the door, locking it tight, her knees buckling as she sank against the wall, phone still recording, the rain's drumbeat a dull roar in her ears. Her heart pounded, a wild thing caged in her chest, but she forced her breath to slow, replaying Pratt's words, the warrant, the lie, assaulting an officer. It was a dagger aimed at her career, her freedom, a move so brazen it screamed coordination. She dialed Carla Hines, her fingers shaking as she waited through the rings. "Carla, it's Lena," she said when her boss answered, voice tight. "Pratt just showed up with a warrant, assault charge from the traffic stop. It's fake, but they're pushing hard." Carla's voice crackled through, sharp with alarm. "They did what?" "I'm calling the DA's office now. This reeks of Vance. Hang tight, I'll get you back up." Lena hung up, staring at the phone, the recording's timestamp ticking past 3 minutes. Carla's call came fast, her tone grim. "DA's dodging me, but I got through to a contact. Vance leaned on them to file it. Claimed you're a threat to order. We're fighting it, but watch your back." Lena nodded to the empty room, her gaze drifting to the rain-streaked window, Pratt's cruiser long gone, but his threat lingering, like smoke. She'd thought she was safe, that her DOJ shield would hold, but this was war now, a war where truth didn't matter, only power did. The warrant was a lie, but it was real enough to cage her, to silence her complaint, to make her the criminal in a system she'd sworn to uphold. She stood, legs steadying, and replayed the recording, Pratt's voice snarling through the speaker, proof she'd cling to. They'd swung hard, but she wasn't down. Not yet. Tell us in comment number 1 if you think Pratt's fake warrant proves the system's out to crush Lena. Hit like if you're furious at how far they'll go to protect Vance, and subscribe, because this fight's about to explode in ways you won't see coming. What happens when a smear campaign turns a hero into a target, and who's pulling the strings to make sure Lena falls? 1 week after Officer Pratt's rain-soaked arrest attempt, Montgomery's streets buzzed with the clatter of morning life, the air crisp at 60 degrees, a rare break from the late summer heat that had gripped Alabama for months. Lena Carter stood at a newsstand 2 blocks from the federal courthouse, her breath fogging in the dawn chill, her navy coat pulled tight against the wind whipping down Dexter Avenue. She'd spent the last 7 days on edge, replaying that night on her porch, Pratt's warrant a ghost that wouldn't fade, her phone's recording her only shield. Carla Hines had worked fast, looping in DOJ brass, and the arrest threat had stalled, the DA's office stonewalling under pressure from above. Lena had dared to believe she'd dodged the worst, that her title, her evidence, her fight might hold the line against Vance's retaliation. She'd even started rebuilding her office, salvaging what she could from the vandalism, her resolve a fire that refused to gut her out. She'd thought the war was still hers to win, that the system couldn't bend far enough to break her. The newsstand loomed ahead, a rickety stall stacked with papers, the vendor a grizzled black man named Otis who'd sold her the Montgomery Advertiser every morning for years. His usual grin was gone today, replaced by a tight-lipped frown as he slid the day's edition across the counter, his eyes avoiding hers. Lena's stomach sank, a cold premonition prickling her skin as she glanced at the headline screaming in bold black ink. Federal prosecutor abuses power, targets innocent cop. Her breath caught, the words a sucker punch, and she snatched the paper up, fingers trembling as she scanned the front page. The article was a butcher's knife, carving her apart with surgical precision. Lena Carter, a federal prosecutor, is under fire for allegedly harassing Officer Dwayne Pratt, a decorated Montgomery PD veteran, with baseless accusations after a routine traffic stop. Anonymous sources claimed she'd fabricated her judicial complaint against Judge Harold Vance to settle a personal grudge, painting her as a race-baiting liar out to ruin good men. Her photo stared back at her, a stern headshot from her DOJ profile now captioned with venom. Carter's vendetta threatens law and order. Lena's knees weakened, the paper crinkling in her grip as she stumbled back from the stand. Otis, muttering a quiet, "Sorry, Miss Carter," that barely reached her ears. The street spun, vendors hawking coffee, kids darting past with backpacks, all blurring into a haze as she flipped through the pages, each paragraph worse than the last. Insiders say Carter's actions stem from a refusal to accept accountability. One line read, while another twisted the knife deeper, her claims of racism are a desperate ploy to deflect from her own misconduct. It wasn't just the advertiser. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, alerts piling up from local TV stations, radio blogs, every outlet in Montgomery parroting the same story, a chorus of lies drowning out her truth. She opened her email, the inbox flooding with hate mail, subject, lines spitting slurs she hadn't seen since the vandalism. Thug in a suit, go crawl back to your hole, you don't belong here. Each word was a brick, stacking a wall to bury her alive. She forced her legs to move, walking stiffly toward the courthouse, the paper tucked under her arm like a wound she couldn't hide. Her mind raced, piecing it together. This wasn't random. Wasn't some rogue reporter's scoop. It was coordinated. A smear campaign with teeth, Vance's fingerprints all over it, Pratt's sneer lurking in the shadows. They'd taken her fight, her complaint, and flipped it into a weapon, turning her from a prosecutor into a pariah overnight. She reached her car, a sleek sedan parked a block from work, and slid into the driver's seat, the quiet a stark contrast to the storm in her head. She'd just turned the key when a crash shattered the stillness, glass exploding inward as a brick smashed through her passenger window, landing heavy on the seat beside her. Lena flinched, her arm flying up to shield, her face shards biting into her sleeve as she twisted to see the street. No one. Just the echo of footsteps fading into an alley, the wind whistling through the jagged hole. Her breath came fast, ragged as she reached for the brick, her fingers brushing a scrap of paper taped to its side. She peeled it off, the scrawl jagged and black, Quit or else. The threat sank into her bones, cold and unyielding, a promise from hands that wouldn't stop until she was gone. She dropped the brick, her hands shaking as she started the car, pulling onto the road with a screech of tires, her eyes darting to every shadow, every passing face. This wasn't just words on a page. It was war spilling into her life, a public, lynching dressed up as journalism, bricks and hate mail, the noose tightening around her neck. She drove to the courthouse, parking in the underground lot, her pulse a relentless drumbeat as she climbed the stairs to her wrecked office, the 5th floor still a mess of broken furniture and smeared paint. Inside, she locked the door, sinking. Into the one chair she'd salvaged, the advertiser spread across her lap like a map of her undoing. Her phone kept buzzing, colleagues texting warnings, Carla's name flashing with a missed call she couldn't bring herself to answer yet. She opened her laptop, pulling up the news sites, the smear spreading like wildfire, Channel 6 calling. Her a disgrace to the badge, a radio host dubbing her the real criminal here. The anonymous sources were a chorus, their voices too unified to be chance, claiming she'd threatened Pratt, staged the vandalism for sympathy, twisted justice for her own gain. It was a caricature, a racist sketch of a black woman too loud, too bold, too dangerous to exist in their world. She'd seen it before, in cases, in history, but never aimed at her, never this sharp, this personal. Lena stood, pacing the room, glass crunching under her boots as she replayed the last week. The arrest warrant had failed, her recording too. Damning, her neighbor's footage too public. But this was worse, a blow she couldn't dodge with evidence or law. They'd turned the city against her, made her a villain in a story she hadn't written, leveraging every trope they could muster. Angry black woman, corrupt official, threat to order. She stopped by the window, staring at the river snaking. Through Montgomery, its calm a mockery of the chaos swallowing her. Vance's allies were behind this, she knew it, their reach stretching from the courtroom to the press, Pratt's grunt work backed by a judge who'd rather burn her down than face her complaint. The brick, the hate mail, the headlines, they were a machine grinding her into dust. She grabbed her phone, dialing Carla, her voice steady despite the tremble in her chest. "Carla, it's me. You see the news?" Her boss's sigh crackled through, heavy with exhaustion. "Yeah, Lena, it's a hit job. Vance has got friends in high places, feeding this crap to every outlet that'll bite. I'm pushing back with DOJ PR, but it's bad." Lena nodded, gripping the phone tighter. "They threw a brick through my car window. Quit or else." "This isn't just PR, it's a threat." Carla swore, her voice sharpening. "I'm escalating it to the Attorney General's office. Stay safe, Lena. They're scared. Hitting you this hard means you're close to something big." Lena hung up, staring at the shattered window across her office, the janitor's note still tucked in her coat. Vance's secrets run deep. She'd thought she could fight clean, but this was dirty, a war where her name, her life were the battlefield. They'd swung again, harder, and she was still standing. But for how long? The federal courthouse in Montgomery stood like a monolith under a late morning sky. The air sharp at 68 degrees, a faint breeze tugging at the flags, snapping above the entrance. 1 week had bled by since the media storm hit Lena Carter. The headlines still echoing in her skull. "Federal prosecutor abuses power," a smear that clung like damp rot. She'd barely slept, her suburban home a fortress of locked doors and drawn curtains, the brick through her car window a weight she carried in every step. Carla Hines had rallied DOJ support, pushing back against the press with official statements, while Lena clung to her phone's recording of Pratt's arrest attempt, the neighbor's footage her lifeline against the warrant's lie. She'd thought she'd turned a corner, that the system might shield her from Vance's wrath, her complaint against him still simmering with the judicial board. Today, she'd fight back in court, expecting a win to claw her name out of the mud. She adjusted her navy blazer, her lawyer Simone Grant at her side, a fierce black woman with a buzz cut and eyes like steel, ready to dismantle Pratt's fiction. Inside, the courtroom hummed with tension, a different space from Vance's dusty kingdom. This one all sleek lines and polished wood, the air cool at 70 degrees from humming vents. The judge, a grey-haired white woman named Ellen Pierce, sat high, her face unreadable as she shuffled papers, her reputation for fairness a faint hope Lena clung to. Spectators filled the pews, reporters scribbling, their pens a restless scratch. Against the silence, the media storm drawing them like flies. Simone stood tall, her voice cutting through the room as she presented their case. Your Honor, the arrest warrant against my client, Lena Carter, is baseless. Officer Pratt claims assault from a traffic stop on August 23rd, but we have audio and video evidence proving no such incident occurred. This is retaliation for Ms. Carter's judicial complaint against Judge Harold Vance, nothing more. Lena sat rigid, her hands folded on the table, her pulse steady as Simone played the recording, Pratt's voice snarling through the speakers. This ain't over, Princess, the Rains roar underscoring his threat. The prosecutor, a wiry white man named Daniel Holt from the DA's office, shifted in his seat, his tie askew, his defense flimsy as he rose. Your Honor, Officer Pratt's report states Miss Carter resisted and struck him during a lawful stop. The warrant's valid and her recordings inadmissible, lacking chain of custody. Simone fired back, her tone sharp. Inadmissible? It's time-stamped, corroborated by 2 neighbors' videos, one from a minor, one from an elderly resident, both submitted to this court. Pratt's report's a lie, and the DA's pushing it under pressure from Judge Vance. Pierce's eyes narrowed, flicking between the evidence and Holt's sweaty brow, her gavel resting still as she leaned forward. I've reviewed the submissions, she said, voice calm but firm. The warrant lacks substantiation. No physical evidence. No dashcam. Just one officer's word against multiple recordings. Case dismissed. Relief flooded Lena's chest. A breath she hadn't known she was holding, escaping in a rush, as Simone squeezed her shoulder, a rare smile breaking through her lawyer's stern facade. The reporters scribbled faster, whispers rippling through. The pews, a small victory in a war that had left her bruised. She stood, her legs steady, feeling the weight lift, if only for a moment. She'd beaten Pratt's lie, turned his blade back on him, and the dismissal was a crack in Vance's armor, proof she could fight and win. She nodded at Simone, her voice low. Thank you. That's one down. Simone's smile faded, her eyes sharp. One down, but they're not done swinging. Lena knew it, felt it in her bones, but for now she let herself savor the taste of triumph, fleeting as it was. She stepped into the courthouse hall, the marble cool under her flats, her phone buzzing with a text from Carla. Good work. DOJ's. Got your back. Lena exhaled, tucking the phone away, her mind already shifting to her next move. The janitor's note, Vance's secrets run deep, had gnawed at her, a thread she'd started pulling between sleepless nights. She'd dug into old case files, cross-referencing Vance's rulings, and one name had surfaced. Jamal Harris, a black teenager sentenced to 20 years for stealing a bike from a garage, a minor theft blown into a felony with no parole. The file was sealed, buried deep in the county archives, but Lena had called in a favor with a clerk friend, Nia Brooks, who'd slipped her a copy. She'd pored over it last night, the details chilling. No fingerprints on the bike, a witness who'd recanted, Vance dismissing exculpatory evidence with a wave of his hand. Jamal was 19 now, 3 years into a sentence that screamed injustice, a kid who'd never stood a chance under Vance's gavel. Lena clutched the file in her briefcase, her plan crystallizing. Expose Jamal's case, tie it to Vance's pattern, blow his misconduct wide open. She'd started drafting a motion to unseal it, her fingers itching to type as she rode the elevator. To her office, the 5th floor still a mess, but hers again. She'd just unlocked the door, the scent of paint thinner lingering from cleanup attempts, when her phone rang, Carla's name flashing. She answered, voice steady. Hey Carla, we got the dismissal. But Carla's tone was gravel, heavy with something dark. Lena, I just got a call from upstairs. They're suspending you, effective immediately. Ethics review. They're saying. Vance's allies pushed it through, claiming your liability after the media hit. Lena froze, the phone slipping in her grip, her victory souring into ash. Suspended, she echoed, her voice hollow, the room tilting as she sank into her chair, the slashed leather creaking under her weight. Carla, we just won. How can... Carla cut in, her words clipped. It's a power play. The AG's office is involved, and they're citing public perception. I'm fighting it, but you're locked out for now. No access to files, no cases. Lena's chest tightened, her breath shallow as she stared at the Jamal Harris file, her lifeline to Vance's downfall now out of reach. The dismissal had been a hollow shell, a win snatched away before she could wield it, Vance's reach coiling tighter around her throat. She'd beaten Pratt in court, but they'd hit her harder, stripping her badge, her power, her fight all in one blow. She hung up, her hands trembling as she shoved the file into her bag, her office suddenly a cage she couldn't escape. The media smear, the brick, the warrant, they were preludes. This was the real strike, a systemic gut punch to silence her complaint, to bury Jamal's story, to erase her from the game. She stood, pacing the wreckage, glass crunching under her boots, her mind racing. Suspension meant no resources, no authority, but she wasn't done. She'd find a way, dig deeper, expose Vance's secrets, even if they locked her out of every room. Her victory had been a mirage, a fleeting gleam before the storm swallowed it whole, and now she was exposed, vulnerable, the war tilting against her. The janitor's note burned in her pocket, a whisper of hope in a fight turning uglier by the hour. Drop a comment number 1 if you think Lena's suspension proves the system's rigged to protect men like Vance. Hit like if you're stunned by how fast they turned her win into a loss, and subscribe because this battle's about to get brutal. What happens when a locked-out prosecutor uncovers a secret too big to bury, and who's waiting to crush her before she can strike? Midnight draped Lena Carter's suburban Montgomery home in a shroud of black, the air thick with the rumble of distant thunder, the temperature holding steady at 62 degrees after a day of brittle sunshine. 3 days had passed since her suspension, the hollow victory of Pratt's dismissed warrant now a bitter memory, her DOJ badge stripped away by Vance's allies in a swift surgical blow. She'd retreated here, her brick two-story a bunker against the storm outside and within. The Jamal Harris file her lifeline, its pages spread across the coffee table under the flicker of a single lamp. She'd spent sleepless nights poring over it, her suspension locking her out of official channels but not her will. Jamal's case was a wound she couldn't leave alone. A black 19-year-old, 3 years into a 20-year sentence for a bike theft, Vance's gavel slamming down despite a recanted witness and no evidence. She'd traced patterns in Vance's rulings, late-night calls to Nia Brooks yielding whispers of other sealed cases, a trail of black lives crushed under his justice. She'd thought suspension was the worst they could throw, that she could regroup, fight from the shadows. She was wrong. The thunder growled closer, a low tremor shaking the windows as Lena sat on her couch, a mug of cold tea cradled in her hands, her navy sweater fraying at the cuffs from restless tugging. The house was quiet. Too quiet, the rains. Patter on the roof, a deceptive lullaby masking the night's edge. She'd locked every door, checked every window, the media smear and that brick through her car, still fresh scars urging caution. Her phone sat silent. Carla's last update a grim, "We're pushing back but they're entrenched." The DOJ battling a bureaucracy that bent for Vance. Lena rubbed her eyes, exhaustion gnawing at her bones, when a crash splintered the silence. Glass shattering downstairs like a gunshot through her skull. She bolted upright, tea spilling across the table, her heart slamming against her ribs as footsteps thudded in the kitchen below, heavy and deliberate, no attempt at stealth. She grabbed her phone, fingers fumbling as she dialed 911, her breath shallow, eyes darting to the stairs. "Emergency, this is Lena Carter. 34 Oak Lane, someone's breaking in," she whispered, voice tight, slipping off the couch to crouch behind it, the lamp's glow casting her shadow long and jagged. The operator's voice crackled, through calm but distant. "Units are dispatched, ma'am, stay on the line." But the line didn't feel like safety, not with boots stomping closer, glass crunching under soles, a low laugh cutting through the storm's roar. Lena's pulse raced, her free hand snatching the Jamal file, shoving it under the couch cushion as shadows loomed at the stairwell, 3 figures ascending, their outlines blurred by ski masks. She ducked lower, the operator's "stay calm," a useless echo as the first intruder hit the landing, a broad-shouldered man wielding a crowbar, his gloves slick with rain. "Where's the little lawyer bitch?" he snarled, voice muffled but venomous, swinging the crowbar into a bookshelf, volumes tumbling like broken wings. Lena's stomach twisted, her mind flashing to Pratt, to Vance, to the hate mail piling up in her inbox. This wasn't a robbery, it was a hunt. The second figure, wiry and quick, darted to her desk, yanking drawers open, papers scattering like ash, while the third, a hulking silhouette, strode to the wall, a can of spray paint hissing in his hand. Red streaks bloomed across the plaster, jagged letters spelling "Nanter Lawyer" in a scrawl that burned into her eyes, a mirror of her office's ruin now invading her home. She pressed herself flat, phone clutched tight, the operator's voice fading as panic clawed her throat. "They're trashing the place," she hissed, barely audible, her other hand groping for anything, a weapon, a shield, finding only a hardcover novel she gripped like a lifeline. The broad-shouldered man kicked over the coffee table, glass shattering across the hardwood, the mug's shards glinting in the lamplight as he roared, "Find her files! She's got nothing left to weigh." "Hide behind!" Lena's chest tightened, the Jamal file inches from her, its edges poking from the cushion, a beacon she couldn't let them take. She slid toward the hallway, silent as a ghost, her socks muffling her steps, aiming for the back stairs to the garage. The wiry one rummaged through her desk, tearing case notes, her lender prosecution in tatters, while the painter laughed, spraying a crude fist over her parents' photo, the frame cracking under his boot. Thunder crashed, masking her gasp, her knees trembling as she reached the stairwell. The operator's units are 10 minutes out, a cruel joke against the seconds ticking down. She crept downstairs, rain pounding the roof, the kitchen a graveyard of shattered glass from the busted window, muddy footprints smearing the tile. She edged toward the garage door, her breath hitching as a shout rang from above. "She's gone! Check the back!" Boots thudded, fast and furious, and Lena bolted, yanking the garage door open, the cold concrete slapping her feet as she dove behind her sedan, its slashed tires a grim reminder of the brick. Headlights flared through the window, a car idling outside, and her blood ran cold. Pratt's cruiser, its silhouette unmistakable, parked across the street, lights off but engine rumbling. He wasn't here, not inside, but he was watching, waiting, the puppet master pulling strings she couldn't cut. She crouched low, phone slipping in her sweaty grip, the operator's voice a lifeline she clung to. "They're coming downstairs," she whispered. "I see Pratt's car outside." The garage door rattled, the wiry man bursting in, his flashlight sweeping the shadows, pinning her against the car's fender. "Gotcha!" he sneered, lunging. But Lena rolled, scrambling under the sedan, her sweater snagging on bolts as she dragged herself across the oil-stained floor. He cursed, kicking the tire, the thud reverberating as she squeezed out the other side, sprinting for the side exit. Thunder roared, drowning his shouts as she stumbled into the yard, rain soaking her to the bone, her phone clutched tight, the operator's "Stay with me," a faint thread. She darted behind a shed, chest heaving, watching the intruders spill out, crowbar glinting, their masks slick with water. They scanned the dark, missing her by inches, then retreated, peeling away in a black SUV that screeched down the street, Pratt's cruiser trailing slow and deliberate, a predator slinking off with its pack. Lena sank against the shed, rain streaming down her face, her sweater clinging like a second skin as sirens wailed in the distance, too late to catch the wolves. She crawled back inside, the house a ruin, walls defaced, furniture smashed, the Jamal file gone, snatched from under the cushion. In their final sweep, she stood in the wreckage, shivering, the red slur glaring from the wall, her sanctuary violated, her fight stripped bare. She called Carla, voice raw. "They hit my house, Carla. Masked men took my files." Pratt was outside watching. Carla's curse crackled through, fierce and low. "I'm sending feds, Lena. This is war now. You're not safe." Lena nodded, staring at the shattered photo of her parents, the paint dripping like blood. Suspension had been a blow, but this was annihilation, a racial vendetta tearing her world apart, Vance's retaliation a beast that wouldn't stop. She'd escaped, but at what cost? Dawn broke over Montgomery's outskirts, painting the sky a bruised orange as Lena Carter sat in a grimy diner off Highway 80, the air thick with grease, and the hum of a flickering neon sign that buzzed at 65 degrees outside. 3 sleepless. Hours had passed since the home invasion. Her brick house now a crime scene cordoned off by federal agents Carla had sent, their flashlights still probing the wreckage as she'd fled. Her navy sweater hung damp and torn, rain-soaked from hiding behind the shed, her phone's battery clinging to life after the 911 call that had barely saved her. The Jamal Harris file was gone, stolen by masked hands, Vance's retaliation stripping her bare, but she wasn't broken. She'd escaped to this dive, a low-slung shack with peeling paint and cracked vinyl booths, summoned by a text from Tyrone Evans, an ex-clerk from Vance's court, who'd reached out at 4 in the morning. "I know his secrets. Meet me. Dawn." Rusty's Diner. Lena had clung to that promise, a lifeline in the chaos, believing she'd found an ally to turn the tide. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and stale fries, a jukebox crooning in the corner, its warble drowned by the clatter of plates from the kitchen. Lena nursed a mug of black sludge, her hands trembling from exhaustion, her eyes scanning the room. A trucker hunched over eggs, a waitress with a limp wiping counters, no one else. Her suspension had locked her out of DOJ resources, the media, smear and home invasion piling weight on her shoulders. But Tyrone's message had sparked hope, a flicker she hadn't felt since Pratt's warrant crumbled. She'd met him once, years back, a wiry black man in his 40s with a nervous tic and a knack for filing, a quiet cog in Vance's machine until he'd quit 6 months ago. If he had dirt, real dirt, she could rebuild, expose Vance's corruption, reclaim her fight. She checked her watch. 5:58, the door's bell jangling as Tyrone slipped in, his grey hoodie damp, his eyes darting like a cornered animal's. He slid into the booth across from her, his hands fidgeting with a napkin, shredding it, into strips as he leaned close, voice low and jittery. "You look like hell, Carter. Heard about your place? Vance is doing." Lena's jaw tightened, her mug clinking against the table as she set it down, her gaze locking onto his. "You said you know his secrets. Talk." Tyrone swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing, then pulled a manila envelope from his hoodie, sliding it across the chipped formica. "This is big. Vance took bribes, cash under the table, to rig cases. Black kids mostly sent up for nothing, sentences maxed out. I saw it, filed the papers, kept copies when I left." "Jamal Harris?" "That's just the start." Lena's pulse quickened, her fingers brushing the envelope. Thick with pages she could feel through the paper, a weapon to wield against the judge who'd turned her life into a battlefield. She opened it, her breath catching as she skimmed the top sheet. A ledger, handwritten dates and dollar amounts next to case numbers, Jamal's among them, $10,000 logged beside his name. A bribe to bury him in prison. Her eyes flicked to Tyrone, hope surging like a tide. "This is gold. Why'd you hold on to it?" He shrugged, his tic twitching his cheek. "Insurance. Vance runs that court like a king, but kings fall. I got tired of watching kids like Jamal rot for his greed. You're the only one crazy enough to use it." Lena nodded, her mind racing, victory tasting close for the first time in weeks. With this she could unseal Jamal's case, link it to Vance's pattern, force the judicial board to act, maybe even the feds. She tucked the envelope into her bag, her voice firm. "I'll protect you, Tyrone. We take this public. Vance is." "Done," he nodded, standing fast, his hoodie shadowing his face. "Good, I'm out. Don't call me unless it's done." He slipped away, the bell jangling as he vanished into the dawn, leaving Lena alone with the ledger, her exhaustion fading under a rush of adrenaline. She paid for the coffee, stepping into the parking lot, the air cool against her skin, her sedan/tires a distant ache, as she'd borrowed Nia's old pickup to get here. She'd just reached the driver's door when sirens screamed, 2 cruisers screeching in from the highway, lights blazing red and blue, pinning her in their glare. Her stomach dropped, her bag slipping in her grip as Officer Dwayne Pratt stepped out, his buzzcut glinting under the rising sun, his smirk a blade she knew too well. "Morning, Carter," he drawled, striding forward, flanked by 2 cops, their hands on holsters, eyes hard. "You're under arrest. Bribery. Tried to pay off a witness, huh?" Lena froze, her mind reeling, the envelope suddenly heavy in her bag. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, voice sharp, stepping back as Pratt loomed closer, his hand snapping out to grab her wrist, twisting it hard. "Tyrone Evans. Says you slipped him cash to lie about Vance. Got it all on record." Her chest caved, a sick wave crashing over her as Pratt yanked the envelope from her bag, tossing it to a cop who ripped it open. Pages fluttering to the asphalt, blank sheets, no ledger. A setup. "That's not true," she said, voice rising, her arm burning in his grip. "He gave me those, said they were evidence." Pratt laughed, a harsh bark, cuffing her hands behind her back, the metal biting into her wrists as he shoved her toward the cruiser. "Sure he did, Princess. Tell it to the judge." The world tilted, her knees scraping pavement as he pushed her in, the door slamming shut, the diner's neon flickering in her periphery. She'd been played, Tyrone a snake in the grass, his nervous tick a mask for betrayal, Vance's trap snapping shut around her. Hours later, locked in a holding cell at Montgomery County Jail, the TV blared through the bars, Tyrone's face on Channel 6, his voice steady now, no twitch. "She offered me money to fake evidence against Judge Vance. I couldn't do it. Had to come clean." Lena's fists clenched, the concrete cold against her back, her hope shredded like the files in her home, the blank pages, a cruel joke. The guard smirked as he passed, tossing her a stale sandwich she didn't touch, her mind spinning through the diner, Tyrone's words, Pratt's timing. It was perfect. Too perfect. Vance's hand guiding every move, turning her ally into a weapon, her fight into a crime. She thought she'd won a piece of the board, that Tyrone's evidence could topple the king, but it was a mirage, a lure, to drag her deeper into the pit. The cuffs left red welts on her wrists, her sweater torn at the shoulder from Pratt's grip, her suspension now a footnote to this. Arrested, framed, a black woman painted corrupt by a system that thrived on her fall. She stared at the bars, fury boiling beneath her shock, the janitor's note a ghost in her memory. Vance's secrets run deep. They'd hit her again, harder, and this time she was caged, her trust a wound bleeding out. Leave a comment. Number 1. If you think Tyrone's betrayal shows how far Vance will go to bury Lena, hit like if you're reeling from this gut punch to her fight, and subscribe because the stakes are about to skyrocket. When a trap this slick snaps shut, what's left for a caged prosecutor to claw her way out with? The Montgomery County Jail loomed like a concrete beast under a sweltering noon sky, the air thick at 85 degrees. The cell block a furnace of sweat and steel as Lena Carter sat shackled to a bench, her wrists raw from cuffs that bit, deeper with every shift. 24 hours had crawled by since Pratt's arrest, Tyrone's betrayal still a knife in her gut, the blank pages he'd handed her a mocking echo of the hope she'd clung to in that diner. She'd been processed like a common thief, fingerprints smudged onto ink pads, mugshots snapping her exhaustion into permanence, her torn navy sweater swapped for an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on her frame. The bribery charge was a lie, a frame-up orchestrated by Vance, but it had teeth landing her here, her suspension now a cage, her DOJ title a whisper no one heard. She'd thought her recording of Pratt, her fight her allies would free her fast, that Carla and the feds would storm in. She'd underestimated the jail's walls, Vance's grip, the system's hunger to break her. The cell block buzzed with noise, inmates shouting over the clang of bars, the air ripe with body odor and desperation, fluorescent lights flickering overhead like a dying pulse. Lena sat alone, her back against the wall, her mind replaying Tyrone's smug face on TV. She offered me money. A lie that turned her into the villain. She'd called Simone Grant from the station, her lawyer's voice sharp with fury, promising a bail hearing by morning. But morning felt a lifetime away in this heat, this hell. She'd smuggled a tiny recorder into her jumpsuit, a pen-sized device she'd grabbed from her bag before Pratt cuffed her, its weight a secret against her ribs, a last shred of defiance. She believed her DOJ ties would shield her, that the feds Carla had sent would pull her out before Vance's claws sank deeper. She was wrong again, and the price was coming fast. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, heavy and slow, a guard swaggering into view, a white man in his 50s with a gut spilling over his belt, his badge glinting Hicks, his eyes locked. On her, a smirk curling his lips as he leaned against the bars, twirling a keyring like a toy. "Well, well, federal hotshot," he drawled, voice thick with Alabama grit. "Heard you're in for bribing folks. Guess them fancy suits don't mean much here." Lena's jaw tightened, her gaze steady despite the ache in her shoulders, the cuffs cutting into her skin. "It's a lie, and you know it," she said, voice low, firm, refusing to bend under his stare. Hicks chuckled, a wet, grating sound, stepping closer, his shadow falling over her. "Don't matter what I know, sweetheart. Matters what the judge says, and Vance runs this show." Her stomach twisted, his words a confirmation she'd dreaded. Vance's reach stretched into these walls, his gavel a ghost haunting her cell. Before she could snap back, Hicks turned, whistling sharp, and the block's noise shifted, a murmur rising as 3 inmates approached, women in orange with hard eyes and clenched fists, their steps deliberate. The leader, a tall black woman with a shaved head and a scar slicing her cheek, cracked her knuckles, her grin feral. "This the one?" she asked, voice rough, nodding at Hicks, who smirked wider, tossing her a nod. "Yeah, teach her some. Manners. Vance don't like uppity types." Lena's pulse spiked, her body tensing as she stood, the bench creaking, her mind racing. This wasn't random, it was ordered. A hit from the judge who'd fined her, framed her, now aiming to crush her spirit. The scarred woman lunged, fist swinging fast, and Lena ducked, the blow grazing her shoulder as she stumbled back, the cuffs rattling, her arms pinned uselessly behind her. "Stay back," she barked, voice sharp, but the other 2 closed in, a wiry Latina with a ponytail grabbing her hair, yanking hard, while a stocky white woman with tattoos drove a knee into her. Gut! Pain exploded, air rushing from her lungs as she doubled over, the recorder digging into her ribs, her only weapon still hidden. She twisted, kicking out, her foot slamming into the Latina's shin. A grunt echoing as the woman staggered, but the scarred leader roared, seizing Lena's arm, twisting it back until a crack split the air, agony searing through her. Her left, forearm snapping like dry wood. She screamed, the sound raw, swallowed by the block's chaos, inmates cheering, Hicks laughing from the bars. Lena fell, knees slamming concrete, her vision blurring as the tattooed woman kicked her ribs, a dull thud of pain blooming with each strike. She gasped, curling tight, her right hand fumbling under the jumpsuit, fingers brushing the recorder, flicking it on as Hicks's voice cut through, casual and cruel. "That's it, girls. Show her what happens when you mess with Vance's court. Break her good." The words burned into her, fuel as she gritted her teeth, forcing her voice out. Hoarse but clear. "You're on tape, Hicks. Vance won't save you." The guard's smirk froze, his eyes narrowing. But the inmates didn't stop, the scarred woman stomping her leg. Pain flaring as Lena rolled, clutching the recorder, its hum a lifeline in the dark. The assault stretched, seconds bleeding into, minutes until a shout rang from the corridor. A second guard sprinting in. A younger black man with wide eyes, his baton raised. "Enough! Back off!" he bellowed, shoving the inmates away, their laughter fading as they retreated. Hicks slipping off with a scowl, muttering about finishing later. Lena lay crumpled, blood trickling from her lip, her fractured arm throbbing, her ribs aching, with every breath. But the recorder stayed pressed to her chest, its tiny light blinking red. The new guard knelt, his voice soft. "You okay, ma'am? Medics are coming." She nodded barely, her voice a rasp. "Get this to Simone Grant, my lawyer. Now." He took the device, slipping it into his pocket, his nod a promise as he helped. Her sit, pain lancing through her with every move. Hours later, released on bail Simone had fought for, Lena stumbled from the jail, her arm in a sling, her jumpsuit swapped for a borrowed jacket, the medic's bandages tight around her ribs. She'd thought she'd won proof, Hicks's voice on tape a dagger to wield, a chance to expose Vance's prison puppets. She'd called Carla from a payphone, voice shaking. "They jumped me, Carla. Guard ordered it. Vance's name all over. Sit. I've got it recorded." Carla's fury crackled through. "Feds are moving, Lena. Stay alive." Lena nodded, limping to Nia's pickup, her breath fogging in the dusk chill, believing she'd turned the tide. She drove home, the streets a blur, pulling into her cul-de-sac as night fell, only to freeze, her headlights catching a nightmare. Her house engulfed in flames, orange tongues licking the sky, smoke billowing thick and black, The brick walls she'd called sanctuary, now ash and ruin. She staggered out, the heat blasting her face, sirens wailing in the distance as neighbors gaped from lawns, her fractured arm useless, her lungs choking on soot. The fire roared, consuming her books, her photos, the last scraps of her fight. Pratt's cruiser nowhere in sight but his shadow everywhere. She sank to her knees, the recorder's proof a hollow win against this. Her home a smouldering grave. Vance's retaliation a sledgehammer that left nothing standing. She'd escaped the jail's fists, but this was deeper, a wound no tape could heal, her breaking point carved in fire and loss. She stared at the blaze, tears cutting through the grime on her cheeks, fury rising from the ashes, a vow to fight even as the world burned around her. 3 days after Lena Carter's home burned to ash, Montgomery's night clung damp and cool at 60 degrees, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth as she crouched in a cramped safe house, a one-room shack on the city's edge, its flickering lights casting jagged shadows across peeling walls. Her arm throbbed in its sling, the fracture from the jail assault a dull ache under bandages, her ribs bruised from kicks that still stole her breath. The fire had taken everything, her files, her sanctuary, her last tether to normalcy, leaving her with Nia Brooks's borrowed pickup and the clothes on her back, a grey hoodie hiding the jumpsuit stains she couldn't wash out. She'd fled the blaze, federal agents swarming too late, Carla's voice on the phone a lifeline. "We've got the recording, Lena. Hicks is on it, Vance named. Feds are moving, but you're not safe." Bail had freed her from jail, but the city was a trap. Pratt's cruiser a ghost in every shadow. Vance's reach a noose tightening with every hour. The safe house smelled of mildew and rust, a single bulb swaying overhead, its buzz a drone against the storm brewing outside. Nia Brooks, her journalist friend, sat across from her at a rickety table. Her braids pulled tight, her laptop glowing with the jail recording, Hicks's voice snarling through tinny speakers. "Show her what happens when you mess with Vance's." Court. Lena's fists clenched, the sound a blade she'd honed, her only weapon left after Tyrone's betrayal. The fire's ruin. She'd thought she'd hit bottom in that cell, the inmate's fists a breaking point. But the flames had carved a deeper wound, racial vengeance torching her life to cinders. Nia had smuggled her here, a hideout owned by an old press contact, no cameras, no trace, a bunker to plan her next strike. "This is it, Lena," Nia said, voice low, fingers flying across keys. "We leak this, go viral, force their hand. You ready?" Lena nodded, her jaw set, her eyes burning with a fire the blaze couldn't snuff. "Do it." Nia uploaded the key. Audio, her contacts at a local news blog pinging within minutes. The file spreading like wildfire across platforms, hashtags blooming. Justice for Lena. Vance corrupt. Lena watched the screen, her breath shallow, the view count ticking past 10,000, then 50. The recording's raw truth cutting through the media smear that had branded her a liar. Protests sparked downtown, voices chanting her name outside. The courthouse, horns blaring through Montgomery's streets. A tide she'd stirred from this crumbling shack. She leaned back, the chair creaking, a flicker of triumph warming her chest, her fractured arm a dull throb she ignored. She'd turned. The tide, she thought. The public's rage a shield. The Fed's wheels grinding faster with every share. Hicks's confession tied Vance to the jail, a crack in his untouchable facade. And for a moment she believed she'd wrested control, that exposure could topple the beast. The laptop chimed, Nia's eyes widening as a live feed popped up. Judge. Harold Vance's pinched face filling the screen, his grey suit crisp under studio lights, a press conference hastily called at City Hall. Lena's stomach knotted, her triumph souring as he leaned into the mic, voice smooth and cold. "Lena, Carter is no victim. She's a domestic terrorist, inciting riots with fabricated lies, endangering our community. This recording is a fraud, a desperate bid to destabilize law and order. We're taking action to protect Montgomery." The room tilted, Lena's breath catching as Nia swore under her breath, the feed cutting to footage of protests, smoke curling from trash fires, police in riot gear clashing with crowds. Vance's words twisted her fight into a caricature. A racist sketch of a black woman as chaos incarnate. Her truth flipped into a threat, her exposure a spark he'd douse with fear. Lena stood, pacing the shack, the bulb's flicker sinking. With her pulse, her mind racing. "He's framing me again," she muttered, voice tight, her good hand raking through her hair. "Turning the protests into proof I'm the villain." Nia nodded, slamming the laptop shut. "He's scared, Lena. This is big. Too big to bury, but he's got power to spin it." Lena stopped, staring at the cracked wall, the jail's bruises aching, the fire's smoke still choking her memory. She'd thought the recording would break him, that public fury would force justice, but Vance had countered harder. His allies painting her a terrorist, a label that could lock her away for life. Her phone buzzed, Carla's number flashing. Her voice urgent when Lena answered. "Lena, feds are raiding Vance's office, but SWAT's coming for you. Vance pushed an emergency order, says you're a flight risk. Get out now." Lena's chest seized, her eyes darting to Nia, who grabbed her bag, shoving the laptop inside. "SWAT?" Nia echoed, voice rising, but Lena was already moving, adrenaline drowning the pain in her arm, her ribs. "They're not taking me," she said, voice steel, yanking the hoodie's hood up as thunder rumbled outside, a storm mirroring the one crashing in. Nia pointed to the back window, a narrow pane fogged with grime. "There, alley's clear. Go." Lena didn't hesitate, shoving the window open, the frame splintering as she climbed through, her sling catching, tearing free as she dropped into the mud below, pain lancing through her arm. She stumbled upright, rain spitting in her face, the safe house's light fading as boots pounded inside, shouts echoing. "Federal warrant! Open up!" She ran, legs pumping, the alley a blur of brick and puddles, her breath ragged, her fractured arms screaming with every jolt. Flashlights swept behind her, SWAT spilling from vans, their radios crackling, a net closing fast. She darted, left, cutting through a junkyard. Rusted cars looming like ghosts, her hoodie snagging on barbed wire as she squeezed past, blood trickling from a fresh scrape. The shouts faded, then surged, a helicopter's thrum pulsing overhead, its spotlight slicing the dark, pinning her shadow to the ground. She dove under a wrecked truck, mud soaking her knees, her pulse a war drum as the beam swung away, giving her seconds to bolt. She reached a drainage ditch, sliding down its bank, water sloshing to her ankles, her good hand clutching a chain-link fence as she hauled herself up the other side, lungs burning, the city's edge a jagged silhouette against the storm. Lena crouched behind a dumpster, rain streaming down her face, her fractured arm numb, her ribs a fire she couldn't quench. She'd escaped barely, a fugitive now, Vance's terrorist. Label a brand that turned her fight into flight. The recording had sparked a war, protests raging, feds moving, but he'd hit back, twisting her counter into a noose, her exposure a double-edged sword that cut her deepest. She pulled her phone, the screen cracked but alive, texting Nia one word. Safe. She'd lost the shack, her shield, but not her will, the janitor's note a ghost in her mind. Vance's secrets run deep. They'd burned her home, caged her, chased her, but she was still running, still fighting, a shadow they couldn't catch. Not yet. Rain lashed the Montgomery riverfront under a storm-choked sky, the temperature plunging to 58 degrees as Lena Carter crouched in an abandoned warehouse, its rusted beams groaning against the wind, howling through shattered windows. Chew. Hours had ticked by since she'd fled the safe house, SWAT's boots still echoing in her skull, her fractured arm throbbing in its torn sling, her ribs a dull ache beneath a soaked grey hoodie. The city was a manhunt, helicopters buzzing overhead, Vance's domestic terrorist label turning her into prey, her viral recording a spark that had ignited protests but couldn't shield her from his wrath. She'd evaded capture, slipping. Through alleys and ditches, Nia's pickup ditched miles back, her phone dead in her pocket, a fugitive with nothing but cunning left. The warehouse smelled of rot and oil, the river's roar a constant pulse outside, its muddy banks glinting under flickering streetlights. She'd lured Vance here with a desperate bluff, a burner phone call to his clerk. Tell him I'll trade silence for cash. Midnight, old shipping yard. She needed his confession, A final blow to end this war. Lena rigged a live stream. A cheap camera Nia had slipped her before the raid, perched on a crate, its lens trained on the warehouse's cavernous heart, broadcasting to a blog, Nia still. Controlled the feed live but silent. Thousands watching her shadow dance across the screen. Her good hand clutched a tire iron, scavenged from the floor, its weight a cold comfort against her chest, her fractured arm useless, but her resolve steel. She'd thought exposure would topple Vance, that the jail recording would break him. But he'd twisted it, burned her life, hunted her down. This was her last stand, a trap to force his truth into the open, to make him bleed as she had. Thunder cracked, shaking the walls as headlights pierced the dark. A black sedan rolling to a stop outside, its engine cutting off, the driver's door creaking open. Judge Harold Vance stepped out, his grey suit pristine despite the storm, his pinched face pale under a street lamp, his eyes glinting with a predator's calm. He strode in, rain dripping from his coat, his boots clicking on cracked concrete. A man who owned every room he entered, even this rotting shell. Lena stepped from the shadows, tire iron low, her voice cutting through the storm's roar. "You came. Guess you're not as untouchable as you think." Vance's lips curled, a smirk she'd seen in his courtroom, his hands in his pockets, casual, unafraid. "Carter, you've got guts, I'll give you that. Cash for silence? Smart play for a terrorist on the run." Lena's jaw tightened, her grip on the iron steady, the camera's red light a heartbeat in her periphery. "I don't want your money, I want the truth. You've rigged cases, taken bribes, ruined lives. Jamal Harris, 20 years for nothing. Say it, Vance, for the world to hear." His smirk faltered, eyes flicking to the shadows, suspicion sharpening his gaze, but arrogance held him firm. "You think you can scare me," he said, voice smooth, stepping closer, his shadow stretching long. "I've run this city for decades. Kids like Harris, collateral. Victor Klein pays me to keep his prisons full, labor cheap, profits high. You're a bug under my boot, Carter, a black girl who got too loud." Lena's chest burned, his confession spilling free, the tire iron trembling in her hand as the live stream hummed, thousands hearing his words, her trap snapping shut. "Klein," she said, voice low, forcing him to keep talking. "Real estate tycoon. He funds your bench. You stack bodies in his cells. How many, Vance? How many lives for his cash?" He laughed, a dry rasp stepping within arm's reach, his eyes cold. "Dozens. Hundreds. Doesn't matter. You've got nothing left, no badge, no home. You're done." Lena raised the iron, her voice rising, sharp and unyielding. "I've got this streaming live. You just confessed, you bastard. The world knows now." Vance froze, his smirk vanishing, eyes darting to the crate, the camera's glint catching his panic. "You're bluffing," he snarled, lunging for it, but Lena swung the iron, glancing off his shoulder, driving him back with a grunt. He stumbled, fury twisting his face, his hand diving into his coat, pulling a snub-nosed revolver, its barrel glinting as he aimed. "You're dead, Carter," he spat, finger tightening, but a shout cut through, Nia Brooks bursting from a side. "Door?" Her phone raised, filming, voice raw. "Drop it, Vance, it's over." He whirled, gun swinging toward her, and Lena lunged, tackling him, her fractured arms screaming as they hit the concrete, the iron clattering away. The gun fired, a deafening crack, Nia crumpling, blood blooming on her chest, her phone skittering across the floor as Lena screamed, rolling off Vance, her good hand clawing for the iron. He scrambled up, revolver swinging back to her, but she swung first, the iron smashing his wrist, the gun flying, his howl swallowed by thunder. She pinned him, knee on his chest, iron raised, her voice a snarl. "You're done, Vance. Nia's dead, and it's on you. Live for the world to see." He thrashed, face purple, but tires screeched outside, lights flooding the warehouse, federal agents swarming in, vests marked FBI, guns drawn. "Hands up!" they barked, yanking Lena off, cuffing Vance as he spat curses, his coat torn, his empire cracking. Pratt burst through, a late shadow, his buzz cut slick with rain, gun raised, but an agent tackled him, pinning him down, his shouts muffled as cuffs snapped tight. Lena staggered back, rain streaming through broken windows. Her eyes locked on Nia's body, blood pooling. Her friend's last act, a sacrifice that broke her open. The camera rolled, the feed live. Vance's confession, Nia's death, Pratt's ambush, all broadcast to a world that roared back, protests surging outside, sirens wailing as the feds hauled Vance and Pratt away. Lena sank to her knees, the iron slipping from her hand, her fractured arm numb, her ribs afire she couldn't quench. She'd won, exposed Vance, tied him to Klein, a real estate tycoon profiting off prison labor. But the cost was Nia, her home, her life, a victory stained with blood and ash. Agents swarmed, one kneeling beside her, voice soft. "You're clear, Miss Carter. We've got Klein in our sights." She nodded, staring at Nia, the warehouse a tomb, Vance's fall a hollow echo against her loss. The storm raged, lightning, splitting the sky, the river's roar a dirge as feds secured the scene. Vance's revolver bagged, Pratt's fury silenced in a van. Lena stood swaying, her hoodie dripping, her gaze drifting to the camera. Its light still blinking, the world watching her stand amid the wreckage. She'd lured Vance, forced his truth, broken his grip, but Klein slipped free. A shadow untouchable. For now, his name a promise of battles to come. Her final stand had shattered the judge, but the war wasn't over. The system's roots deeper than one man's fall. Her fight a flame that burned on, even as Nia's blood stained the floor. Dawn bled across Montgomery's federal courthouse steps, the rain-soaked air sharp at 55 degrees, a grey mist curling around the brick facade as Lena Carter stood amid the chaos, her fractured arm throbbing in its sling, her grey hoodie plastered to her skin with sweat and storm water. Hours had passed since the warehouse showdown, Vance's confession still echoing in her skull, his revolver's crack as it took Nia's life a wound that wouldn't clot. Federal agents swarmed the scene, their vans clogging the riverfront, lights flashing red and blue against the fading night. Vance and Pratt hauled off in cuffs, their faces twisted with rage and defeat. The livestream had exploded, millions watching Vance admit to rigging cases for Victor Klein, the real estate tycoon whose private prisons fattened on black lives like Jamal Harris's. Nia's blood the price of that truth. Lena's chest ached, her ribs bruised from the fight. Her good hand clenched into a fist as she watched the feds secure the warehouse, her victory a bitter taste, sharp with loss, but solid as the concrete beneath her boots. The crowd swelled. Beyond the barricades, protesters chanting her name. "Justice for Lena, free Jamal!" Their voices a roar that drowned the river's murmur, signs bobbing in the damp air, a tide she'd unleashed with that camera's unblinking eye. Reporters jostled, cameras flashing. Their shouts a buzz she ignored, her gaze fixed on the vans rolling away. Vance's pinched face glaring through a window. Pratt's buzz cut bowed in defeat. An agent approached, a tall black man in tactical gear, his badge gleaming Parker, his voice steady. "Miss Carter, you're cleared. Charges dropped, suspension lifted. Vance is done, and we're raiding Klein's offices now. Your evidence tipped it." Lena nodded, her throat tight. Nia's body still warm in her memory. The recorder, the live stream. Her final stand, the hammer that cracked their empire. "Thank you," she rasped, her eyes drifting to the courthouse. Its steps a stage she'd climbed from $1,000 fine to this, a war she'd won against men who'd burned her life to ash. She turned, limping toward the crowd, her fractured arm a dull pulse, her ribs aching with every breath. The protesters parting as she passed, their cheers a balm she couldn't fully feel. Carla Hines pushed through, her gruff voice breaking the din, her coat soaked as she gripped Lena's shoulder. "You did it, kid. DOJ's launching a statewide probe, judicial corruption, Klein's network. You're a damn hero." Lena's lips twitched, a tired smile that didn't reach her eyes, Nia's sacrifice a shadow over the win. "Hero?" she echoed, voice hollow, glancing at the courthouse, its flags snapping in the wind, a symbol she'd fought for, bled for, nearly died for. The feds had Vance, Pratt, evidence stacking high, Klein's name on every tongue, justice long delayed. Finally clawing free, she let herself breathe deep and slow, the mist cool on her face, believing the scales had tipped, that her war had shattered the beast. The crowd's roar shifted, a murmur rippling through as phones buzzed, heads turning, a breaking news alert, cutting through the dawn like a blade. Lena frowned, pulling her cracked phone from her pocket, its screen flickering to life as Carla swore beside her. What now? The headline blazed, bold and black. Victor Klein, appointed Alabama attorney. General in emergency vote. Lena's breath stopped, her knees buckling, the phone slipping in her grip as she stared, the words a sledgehammer to her chest. Appointed overnight, a shadowy council of state officials, Klein's cronies, had pushed it through while Vance burned, a move so swift, so brazen, it mocked her fight. The story scrolled, Klein's smug face beaming from a press photo, his voice smooth in a clip. I'll restore order, root out corruption, starting with rogue elements like Lena Carter. Her victory crumbled, ash in her mouth, the crowd's cheers souring into gasps, protests stalling as the truth sank in. She staggered back, the courthouse steps cold under her flats, her good hand clutching Carla's arm, her fractured one screaming as she gripped too hard. How? She rasped, voice breaking, her eyes darting to the skyline where a billboard loomed. Klein's image plastered across it, his smile a taunt, untouchable now. The state's top lawman. Carla's face hardened, her voice low. His allies moved. Fast use Vance's fall as cover. Emergency session, no oversight. He's got dirt on half the legislature, Lena. This is checkmate. Elena's chest heaved, her ribs a fire she couldn't quench. Nia's death, her home's ashes, the jail's fists, all for this. Vance down, Pratt caged, but Klein rising, his empire not just intact, but crowned. The feds had raided his offices, but he'd slipped the net, his power deeper than one judge, one cop, a system that bent to shield him. She turned, facing the crowd, their faces a blur of shock and rage, her phone buzzing with alerts, the live stream's echo now a dirge. She limped to a reporter's mic, shoved in her face, her voice raw but steady, cutting through the mist. Klein's a criminal, profiting off black lives, rigging justice with blood money. I've got proof and I'm not done. This isn't over. The camera rolled, her words a vow, her fractured arm raised, her hoodie dripping, a warrior battered, but unbowed. The crowd roared back, fists pumping, a spark reigniting, but her eyes locked on that billboard. Klein's grin a promise of war to come. Agents flanked her, Parker's voice urgent. We'll fight it, Ms. Carter. DOJ's not backing down. She nodded, staring at the dawn, the mist a veil over a city she'd bled for, her win a mirage, justice a ghost slipping through her fingers. Lena stepped back, the courthouse a monolith behind her, its steps slick with rain, her good hand brushing. The sling, Nia's blood a stain she'd carry forever. Vance was gone, Pratt silenced, but Klein stood higher, his appointment a reversal that flipped her triumph into defeat, a system so rotten it crowned its own monsters. She turned to the camera, the world watching, her voice a whisper that roared. I'll keep fighting. For Jamal, for Nia, for every life they've crushed. Klein's next. The lens held her, a promise etched in her gaze, the crowd surging behind her, sirens wailing as feds scrambled, Klein's shadow stretching long and dark. She'd shattered one beast, but another rose, untouchable for now, her war a flame that burned on, defiance her last stand against a dawn that mocked her with its light. Lena Carter's journey unveils a harsh truth. Justice isn't guaranteed even for those who wield it. Her fight against Judge Harold Vance and Victor Klein exposes a system riddled with corruption, where power shields the guilty and punishes the righteous. The first lesson is resilience. Lena faced a racist judge, a brutal cop, a torched home, and a betrayal, yet she stood tall, turning every blow into fuel. Her story screams that silence enables oppression. Speaking out, even at great cost, can spark change. Second, it's a stark reminder that systemic racism isn't loud or obvious. It hides in courtrooms, newsrooms, and backroom deals, thriving when good people look away. Lena's battle shows that one voice can crack that facade, but victory is fleeting when the roots run deep. Third, trust is a luxury. Her allies' betrayal taught her to lean on evidence, not promises. Finally, justice demands sacrifice. Nia's death and Lena's losses prove the price of truth is steep, yet worth it. This isn't just her fight. It's a mirror for us all, asking what we'd risk to dismantle a machine that profits off pain. Klein's rise as Attorney General twists the knife, showing that winning battles doesn't always win wars. but quitting isn't an option. What would you do in Lena's shoes? Back down or burn brighter? Drop a comment with your take, hit like if her courage moves you, and subscribe and share to keep this fight alive. Thank you for standing with us. Stay bold, stay just, and keep pushing for what's right.